All right, hey everybody. It's been a long time since I've done a live, but I'm excited to get back into the rhythm of things. It's just been busy with Ratio Christi, the ministry that I work for that does campus stuff. As you would imagine, it's the beginning of the year, and so we just have a lot going on. I had a training this week on talking with people about abortion, and we were on campus Monday and Tuesday, and then we have a big event tomorrow with Abdu Murray. And so I've just been crazy busy and just trying to find the time to get back on here to do stuff. I'm excited today. We have a guy named Vaughn Mancha, and he is a part of Ratio Christi. Him and I connected as I'm just trying to find different speakers to be able to come in and kind of bring areas of expertise that they know more about a subject than I do, because there's so much to learn that I know that I just can't keep up with it. And so one of the things that I know I can do is I can connect people with resources, the people that I know. And as I reached out to other people involved with Ratio Christi, Vaughn was quick to talk up and say that he would love to share a little bit about evolution stuff and specifically what's called epigenetics. This is a really cool thing that we're learning more about, and it's really starting to kind of put a lot of questions to this whole idea that all of creation or all of life has been a result of evolutionary processes. And so, with this, I'm excited to have Vaughn. Thanks for joining us on the show today. I'm excited to have you share with us and just teach us about, like I said, a subject that I don't feel like I have enough of a grasp on. So, thanks for joining us.
Good to be had.
Awesome. Vaughn, so would you mind sharing just to start off, how did you get involved with Ratio Christi with just interest in apologetics? Tell us a little bit of kind of your story and testimony.
Well, I've been a Christian since a young age, and I've always been interested in studying under pastors that taught the scripture verse by verse in the Greek and the Hebrew.
Mm,
And that did a great deal of preparing me for things like college, et cetera, because I was a biology major in college, and Darwinism was at its peak at that time. And I was able to see that there were problems with the theory in the courses that I was taking. But I didn't really challenge. It didn't really challenge me at that time. I was slated towards going towards medicine, so I just basically got my A in evolution, whatever, and I didn't argue with anybody,
yeah.
and so went off to medical school. And strangely, in medical school, they really don't even talk about Darwin or evolution because it really didn't have any impact. And
Mm,
I thought that was really peculiar, but it really didn't. So I went into practice and I came across this ministry called Reasons to Believe with Hugh Ross. And I read this
yeah.
book he wrote called Fingerprint of God. And I was like, wow, this is incredible because he was putting science to faith and it was really
Right.
securing my faith. Not that I really felt shaken, but I felt better that I could answer the tough questions from the naturalists.
Yeah,
And
that's awesome. I got a chance to take a class in seminary school when I was at Southern Evangelical with Ross, and that was incredible. I loved it.
you're talking about in North Carolina?
Yeah, yep.
Okay.
He just did a one-off class. I don't think he regularly teaches there, but he
Yeah.
did one semester that he offered a class through SES, and I jumped at it because I've heard a lot of his stuff and have really
Well,
enjoyed it.
I went. That's where I actually got started with Ratio Christi. A regional director spoke at our RTB group, and then I went to SES about 8 years ago.
Okay,
And at that time, Hugh Ross was really not on their radar, but now he's like one of their main guys.
right.
So they realize the value of it,
Hmm.
and so that's what I've been involved with. That what happened is about 7 years ago, I read this article in Nature Journal. Okay, out of all the journals everybody reads, about 50% of the time they read Nature Journal because it is the Bible, if you will, of evolution and everything. And
Okay.
they came out with this article called "Does Evolution Need a Rethink?" And I
Hmm.
couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
And all these guys were talking about how evolutionary theory was not explaining things anymore. And so I basically latched on to that field, and it was called epigenetics. And I set up my Google Scholar alert to send me every article that came out on it,
Oh
which have
wow.
been several thousand articles. I haven't read all of them, but I've browsed the titles and read a couple thousand of them. Let's put it that way.
Right.
And so that's my background and why I dig in on epigenetics, and it's changing everything.
Hmm. Yeah.
Especially in the last 6 months. There's just been some nuclear bombs that have come out that have just totally rocked the foundation of evolution.
Okay.
So it's quite exciting to me.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So there's obviously a lot that comes into this whole field of epigenetics. Could you just kind of give like a very basic thing of like, I know a lot of it is really showing how we used to think everything was just in DNA, and that's really not the case. There's a lot more going on. What is just the if you give like an elevator pitch, 30-second pitch, what is epigenetics?
Why don't you share that first slide that I gave you?
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
And it discusses what epigenetics is. It's the study of how our behaviors and environment can affect changes by affecting the way the genes work. They can be reversible, and they put tags on top of the DNA, but they don't change the DNA, which is completely different than neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism posits that the DNA changes, and that's why we act differently. This says no. We're given a tool set of DNA, and it plays it differently in different people. Okay. And so it's totally different. No change to the DNA.
Got it. So would this even be saying, like, I think one of the typical things that people talk about, since the beginning with Darwin is like the finches. Is it possible that the finches changes is just an epigenetic thing?
Well, that's actually one of the slides.
Okay.
You'll see a picture of finches. It's a slide about 4 or 5 down. It's got a picture of finches. Okay, this Darwin's finch, when Darwin was riding on the ship, the Beagle, into the Galapagos Islands, he came across the finches, and it's the foundation of his evolutionary work. It's almost all based on this. He writes about several other things, but this is an icon. 8 years ago, a group of people said, hey, wait a minute. Maybe it's not the DNA that changes, like mutations, but maybe it's the epigenes that change. So they studied the epigenes that sit on top of the DNA, and they discovered that it changed the beak size and everything more, and that the mutations that is in the DNA did not correspond to the beak sizes. So that completely blew away Darwin's evolution and the way things work, because it's all based on mutations and thinking that the mutations makes us better.
Right.
So that was a foundational study that came out.
Right. So in case somebody's kind of new to the whole science of all of this, could you explain why that would end up kind of disproving evolutionary thought? It's like, why couldn't epigenetics just be the different mode that evolution brings about what it claims?
Could you show slide 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 down?
Yeah, for sure.
You see mutations and no mutations.
Let's see. I'm just going to make sure I get the right. Yep. Yeah, I'll pull that one up. Okay.
Okay, on the left it says mutations, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay, now fortunately, the theory of evolution is very simple. At its foundation, a mutation must occur on the DNA to make a better being that is naturally selected for. And that's what you see on the left-hand side. According to the theory of evolution, a mutation, you see a yellow star happens and changes the DNA sequence, and then the phenotype, which represents the body, is improved and it's naturally selected for. That's the whole theory of evolution in a nutshell. Okay. Now, epigenetics on the right is completely different. There are no mutations. So just like with the Darwin's finches, it had mutations, but the mutations were not changing anything.
Okay.
And then you see the little purple tag that sits there. It's a tag. It's not a mutation. And it represents different forms of epigenetic changes. And that's what causes the overt change outward. And it occurs at 10,000 to 100,000 times as fast as a mutation will cause change. So. Wow. Yeah, so on the left, we have thousands of articles out there that have said, okay, there's maybe a slight change in an enzyme or protein from a mutation, but none of them are showing like a whole new enzyme or a whole new body plan from things, whereas epigenetics is showing a whole new body plan in a matter of a few generations, Wow. And they're studying things like the finch, which changed in a very short period of time. From a Darwinian standpoint, those finches should not have changed, but for hundreds of thousands of years, but they changed within hundreds of years. And Epigenetics can cause that change, but they'll go right back to what they used to be before that change occurred on those different islands. So epigenetics goes both ways. You know,
Okay.
it acts fast, but it also can revert to the, to the norm.
Right.
So,
So
and that makes it so different.
right. So is it possible that someone could argue that, like, as I look at that, especially looking at that slide, it seems like, all right, you have the same effect through having this modification that happens on top of the DNA versus changing the DNA as far as what it does to the creature.
That's correct.
Could it be that epigenetics would just then, like, because if the evolutionary theory is essentially saying that through these mutations, eventually it changes to a whole nother species. Couldn't one argue that this epigenetics, through enough epigenetics, you could change to a whole new species? Like there's just a lot of those, just like there's a lot of mutations, and it turns into a whole new species?
Well, one of the problems with neo-Darwinism is it cannot explain rapid changes like the Cambrian explosion.
Right.
Um, and so the whole macroevolution debate, which you're talking about, they really don't have an answer for it. However, some of the epigenetic mechanisms that have come along include things called transposable elements, which are pieces of DNA that are kind of like viruses, and they can shift around to rewire everything. But it does it without mutations, without a neo-Darwinian mutation model. But they do feel like it might, in fact, explain the changes in species, et cetera. But it's completely different than the neo-Darwin model. So yeah, speciation, I think, is going to be explained ultimately through epigenetics, but it's not going to be, random mutations, et cetera. The main thing about neo-Darwinism is they want to hold on to everything occurring as though it's random, and therefore, if everything's random, we really don't have free will, do we? Or there is no need for a designer, et cetera, because it's just random and we're just meat sacks.
Right.
They're at the bottom of it all, there's no values, there's no morals or nothing. And that's the philosophical pull of neo-Darwinism. Epigenetics, on the other hand, brings teleology back into it because these are cellularly designed mechanisms that do this. They're not just randomly doing this. And it's changing the whole story and approach. You have to say, oh my, holy cow. In fact, one biologist said, we've learned that half of everything we thought we knew is wrong. The only problem is we don't know which half is wrong. Right? I mean,
Okay.
it's so complex.
Yeah.
Epigenetics is so much more complex than regular genetics that it just blows the doors off of all these things.
Right.
I could show you, if you go 3 slides, one slide up, I can show you kind of a brief overlook of epigenetics.
Yeah, for sure. Got it.
Now, in this picture, you see that we have a chromosome, and then it's got chromatin, which makes up the chromosome. And then there's little yo-yo balls that wrap the DNA up, and then these little red tags, which are the epi tags or epigenetic tags, sit on top of the DNA to make the DNA do what it's going to do. Now, here's the thing. If you unraveled your DNA in your cell, you have 40 trillion cells and 6 feet of DNA in each cell. If you put that end to end, it would go to the sun and back 600 times. A spaceship at the fastest speed that we can go right now would take 500,000 years to get to the end of one person's DNA. Well, that means the DNA must be incredibly controlled and wrapped up in the balls, and it's all controlled by epigenetics. So it's not the Darwinian string of DNA that's just sitting there doing nothing. It's all the epigenetics is completely controlling the DNA, how it's repaired, how it's expressed, and everything else, and also how it can change dramatically. So it's a different way of looking at things.
Right. Yeah.
If you go one slide up above that, that's what I was taught in college and is being taught today, actually. This is what's called the central dogma of molecular biology, which was proposed by Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA molecule. Mm-hmm. And if you see, it goes from DNA to RNA to protein. And again, mutations occur at the DNA, and then its effects play out to the RNA and the protein. All this biology that's been going on has been at the DNA level. They do evolution studies on the DNA, and they were ignoring the RNA. The evolution is really occurring at RNA. And what I mean by evolution, the ability to change is at the RNA. The RNA splices, which is something Darwinism doesn't explain. It shifts around and it can come up with new proteins apart from the DNA. So
Mm-hmm.
it's got the greatest variability, and yet the way they study things is like at the DNA because that's where the mutations occur. It's a very simple model that they have, but it's also very, because of its simplicity, it's falling apart.
Mm. So you're talking about the teleology of this. Is there some extent that like with this epigenetics, they seem to be saying that like the RNA or whatever is almost kind of realizing, okay, if we change this, it's going this the whole organism is going to survive better. Like with the beak,
That,
it's almost
that's correct.
consciously knowing that.
Yeah, you can go back down to the slide that you can go one slide down which we were just talking about. Okay, the DNA's got a standard toolkit. Just about every animal on the planet shares about 90% of the same DNA. Now
Mm-hmm.
that makes the argument for are we all from a common design, ancestors. But that 90% that we share is only of the 2% of our DNA called exonic DNA. The rest of it is junk DNA. They completely threw away the concept of junk DNA. And that was the biggest snafu in biology's history because the junk DNA, you can see on the bottom of this picture, there's this microRNA
Mm-hmm.
that's interacting with the messenger RNA. The junk DNA is that microRNA, and it reshapes the messenger RNA to do all kinds of different things. So, but it does it much quicker, 10,000 to 100,000 times faster. So you can take one set, a toolkit, and make whatever you want. Now, let's say that your exons, the 2% that we have in our body, and we have the same exons as a chimp and as a mouse. We're only 1% different in our exons. Well, a mouse has ears, a mouse has arms and other things like that. Uh, Ours, on the other hand, are a little bit different. Now, what if you wanted to say you're a contractor and you wanted to make a house and a building and a church, several other buildings?
Mm-hmm.
What would you need to build that? You would need windows, you need doors, doorknobs, etc. Very common elements that's in all of them. Well, that's why we're given this toolkit to make all those different things. But it's not the 2% toolkit that really differentiates us. It's that junk DNA that's going around saying, okay, I want 5 doorknobs here and I want a window here. And that's what we're discovering. As an example, chimpanzees and human beings, even though they share a lot of the same DNA sequences, the junk DNA, or the non-coding RNA that is on the bottom of this picture, changes the nerve cells dramatically so that we have a huge difference between our brains and the chimpanzees based on that.
Okay.
And they don't have an answer for that. They're holding on to this similar amounts of stuff. Maybe we're related. Well, that may be the case. But on the other hand, you can't explain this junk DNA because it's outside of neo-Darwinism. If you're if the junk DNA does not code for protein, then you're not. If you go one side up,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that the central dogma says the DNA goes to RNA goes to protein. That's it. You got to have protein because if you don't have protein, you don't have an external change for natural selection. Well, if you're not coding for protein, natural selection isn't working. So natural selection is not working on 98% of our DNA. I mean, that's huge right there. It
Yeah.
almost natural selection does happen, but it's really quite minor when you really look at it, and they're ignoring the huge part of it. So they're scrambling for right now to try to borrow some of the epigenetic stuff that's coming out, but it's so different than neo-Darwinism. There's really no way to put the two together, and they realize that.
Mm.
But they still swing at one another. The,
Right.
the people that are for it and not.
Got it. So just to even clarify, I want to make sure that I'm understanding. When they say that we share 98% of the same DNA as a chimpanzee, they're really not looking at all of the DNA. They're looking
Correct.
at all of the DNA that we seem to have understood at that time.
Well, we
And
understood the other, but only 2% is what they're looking at. We
okay,
have 98% of the 2%. But the
okay,
non-coding stuff that's 98% is different, very
right.
different.
So this is almost kind of like the case of like buying juice and they say it's 100% juice
Yeah,
and really like 2% of the juice is 100% juice and then there's a
that's
bunch
right.
of rest. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, and they were calling it junk DNA, and that man, that flew in their face. The biggest place it blew up was the Human Genome Project, which was 20 years ago, and they really only studied the 2%.
Yeah.
And Craig Venter, who is a guy that did the same thing that the government did, the government was doing it through the NIH and Francis Collins. Venter was a private industry guy, and he solved the DNA and completely sequenced it in 9 months, whereas it took the other guys 10 years. And that they had to give him credit
Hmm.
partly but they tried to take credit for his work basically. But he said we learned nothing from this whole thing, and the whole reason was because they didn't study the junk DNA.
Hmm.
Uh, there was a big program though called ENCODE 10 years later did study the junk DNA, and they said, guess what? 90% of the junk DNA is doing stuff. We don't know what it's doing, but it's definitely doing stuff. And that blew their heads up again. They didn't want to believe it. They're saying, no, no, that can't be. You can't you can't find an article that coming out of Google Scholar that almost daily talking about some new function for junk DNA.
Okay.
Um, and that's so anyway, that whole issue about the common ancestry cuts both ways,
Hmm.
because if they're going to say we're common ancestry, then you're going to have to say, well, that's from junk DNA, and you're already wrong on junk DNA. We're probably going to disprove you on common ancestry,
Hmm.
or have a different view of it.
Right. So what was the reason they called it junk DNA? Was it just because we didn't really understand what it was doing at that time?
No, they understood that it was not coding protein,
Okay.
therefore it was junk. And
Got it.
only if you have protein can it be. You got to have a bigger arm or prettier face, and get to marry somebody else, and your kids are all going to have bigger arms and pretty faces
Hmm.
because of the protein. That's natural selection, the survival of the fittest.
Hmm.
Junk DNA didn't do any of that, but they discovered that it's actually rewiring the 2% to tell it what to do, just like with the windows and doorknobs.
Okay.
So it's a totally different approach.
Got it.
This is, yeah, I just wrote an article on this about the Neanderthal, because Neanderthal shares about 2% of that 2%. That 2% that we all share,
Hmm.
they have about 2% of that in common with us.
Hmm.
But they discovered that the genes that code for your arms and legs, and they're called Hox genes, that they were incredibly different. And that's why they have the big forebrows and the different powerful arms, etc., because their junk DNA is different than ours. So it really doesn't matter if we happen to share a little bit of DNA with them. We're so different because of the junk DNA. And
Okay.
it's a different way to look at things.
Got it. Okay. So how is the scientific world kind of responding to this? Is this one of those things that's like, as far as those who are actually doing the science on this are accepting this and seeing the problems that it's bringing with evolution, and it's not
No,
getting to the academic world yet?
no, it's a
Or
fist fight.
yeah.
It's a fight in a dish with a knife.
Okay.
They the evolution guys have been over, especially over the last 8 years, are just seeing all their stuff drain away.
Hmm.
And I would say a good half of the evolutionary biologists realized Darwin was wrong at this point.
Okay.
And what's also interesting is the younger people don't care about Darwin. They're not grabbing Darwin's coattails and saying we're going to prove this stuff,
Right.
because there's been hundreds of thousands of articles already working on micro evolution, and we all recognize that. But they all these studies really need to be redone to include the epigenetic effects. And
Hmm.
so that's what they want to get into epigenetics. That's where the money meets the road. I don't know if you remember the Ghostbusters
Yeah.
when they're thrown off campus. He said, "Hey, we can go work for private industry." He said, "You never work for private industry. They expect results." And the same thing. The
Yeah.
college professors, you could just write another Darwin did it with no real significant stuff, and you can get your paper passed. Uh,
Okay.
but now with the epigenetics, you're not going to hit pay dirt, and you're not going to get research from medical places because they're looking for the epigenetic mechanisms of illness.
Hmm.
And that's where the younger people want to do.
Right.
Uh,
Because
at a
science should
conference,
progress.
well, it is, but
That's the whole idea.
they're really being obstinate, like they don't want anything to do with it.
Hmm.
There was at the Royal Academy in England, they had a meeting. The guy that runs it is a Nobel Prize guy, and he says, "Hey, let's talk about this epigenetics. It seems to be new."
Hmm.
20 different members wrote these horrible letters saying it's just all a bunch of crap and nothing. It's not for real, and really ran it down. Well, the guy pushed it through, and it was an immense success. And one of the guys that was involved with epigenetics and this new evolutionary theory, and the new evolution, by the way, is called EES, Extended Evolutionary Synthesis, which differs
Okay.
from the modern synthesis, what we're left with now. And somebody asked him a question. He said, "Isn't this just a cultural battle between the EES and the neo-darwinists?" He said, "Yes, it's a battle, and one that we're going to win." And half the audience broke out cheering. I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Hmm.
They were probably young, so in the past that would not have happened. It's basically, I would say we're getting over the roller coaster hump and getting ready to go down the other side where everyone's going to say, "Well, I didn't really believe in Darwin." I mean, but now if you get out there in the creation websites on Facebook, those guys really don't know what's going on. They really don't, and all they want to support neo-Darwinism as though it's a fact like gravity. And you show them these articles, and they really push back hard, but
Hmm.
they're starting to get quieter and quieter, because more and more people are putting them out there, and
Right.
that's what's really exciting. And
Right. So when you say like there's neo-Darwinism and then this kind of new, he called it ESS. What was that?
well, okay, Darwinism started with Darwin, and then in the 1900s, Darwin was going down. By the way, nobody was really accepting him that much in the
Hmm.
late 1800s. And then they discovered Gregory Mendel's work, which was actually scientific genetic work. He did 2,500 experiments and proved his work. Darwin did no experiments at all.
Right.
He did reason to induction, which was he was very clever about it, but it had no experiential backing to it.
Hmm.
So when they realized that, they said, "We're going to have to throw out Darwinism." But somebody said, "No, we'll incorporate Darwinism and we'll call it neo-Darwinism." It should have been called neo-Mendelism because he was the guy that really discovered genetics.
Hmm.
So they stole the title, and then in 1942 they rewrote it to what's called the modern synthesis. And that, when you say I believe in evolution, you're saying that you believe in the modern synthesis. And then about 15 years ago, all these guys are pushing back, and they said we need to extend the synthesis. So they're calling it the extended evolutionary synthesis, and it's not been accepted yet, but most of the tenets are being accepted by the younger people, especially. And
Okay.
it's because if you get on PubMed and do a search on epigenetics, you'll get 123,000 journal articles in the last 10 years alone.
Wow.
Where if you search the modern synthesis in parentheses, you'll get 200 in 10 years.
Okay.
It's almost no push on the modern synthesis. They just think that everyone's going to keep accepting it, but they've not done any research to prove it. It's just dead in the water.
Hmm.
And out of those 200, half of them are saying it's not working anymore, and they're just addressing it. So,
Yeah.
it's a dead theory walking, and it's just a matter of time that more and more people are going to learn that.
Right. So then when you use the term the extended synthesis, that's not really even speaking of evolution anymore. That's just saying
It,
there's this epigenetic thing and it's not really evolution anymore.
well, the word evolution is holy in sacrosanct, so everyone has to accept evolution.
Okay.
Um, well, let me give you an example. Weeman and Craig wrote a book about Adam, historical Adam, and evolution.
Right.
I did a search through his book. I looked for neo-Darwinism, no hits. Modern synthesis, no hits. Extended evolutionary synthesis, no hits. Epigenetics, no hits. He didn't address the theory of evolution one time in his book,
Hmm.
and yet it's promoting evolution.
Hmm.
I like William Craig, but he really shouldn't have written that one.
Hmm.
The only thing he would say is evolution, but that's not a precise term. You can say my
Okay.
life evolved during the day because I had a ham sandwich, which changed, and I did this, and I moved the furniture, and
Yeah.
that all evolved. Well, that's evolution. it has to mean something.
Right.
And yeah,
It's a buzzword for sure. I feel like people, I mean, I was an English minor and we talk about like the evolution of literature and those sort of things.
yeah,
Because to
yeah.
say that almost gives you credence because you've been
That's
able to
right.
put it in there.
So, but that's not appropriate. They need to say the modern synthesis says
Mm-hmm.
this, and the modern synthesis is a mutation, a better outcome. But they're not talking about it right now. The only thing they're really hanging on to is the word natural selection.
Okay.
But epigenetics is actually showing that natural selection is not needed. And again, and this is a bombshell article that came out in Nature in January, and it said that 90% of mutations that occurred are actually teleologically directed epigenetic mutations. 90%. So if you don't have the
Yeah.
mutations, what are you going to do natural selection on? And okay, these guys, they worship at the altar of Darwin. They put in this in the article natural selection. They put it in there, even though there was no proof of it. They were really showing something completely different. And they
Mm-hmm.
said that this overchanges 100 years of dogma, that everything was just random. It's not random at all. It's very directed
Right.
for a cause. And the reason, and in fact, what's interesting about epigenetics is most of the time it doesn't cause a DNA change, but sometimes it does facilitate mutation in order to make a different individual. But it directs the mutation, and it's not random in the way
Mm-hmm.
it does. So,
Hmm. Wow. Okay. Well, what other things would you think are important for people to kind of grasp out of this that we haven't covered to this point?
um, well, why don't you go down to where you see the DNA that's the red helix? Random mutations are an important part of the theory.
Yep. Got
Okay.
it.
This was that January article. Random mutations are an important part of the theory of evolution. That is an understatement. It is the theory of evolution. Unless you have random mutations, um, in which mutations give rise to adaptation or is passed off to. But then go down to the next picture.
Okay.
They concluded that epigenetic mutational bias, and that word bias means that epigenetics is controlling the mutations or change,
Yeah.
challenges the prevailing paradigm. The prevailing paradigm, this is the prevailing paradigm going all the way back to Darwin,
Mm-hmm.
that mutation is a directionless force in evolution. Philosophically, let that soak in. Mutation is a directionless force of evolution. That is philosophically why they like it. They don't want there to be a God of direction or
Right.
but this is saying that teleology isn't in play. And it says our discovery yields a new account of the forces driving patterns of natural variation, not natural selection, but natural variation, challenging a long-standing paradigm regarding the randomness and mutation. That paragraph, those two paragraphs right there are absolute nuclear bombs, and they've occurred in the last 6 months. And I can't tell you that how many other articles that are coming out there blowing this stuff apart. That is the whole foundation of Darwinism and those things, and yet they're saying that we've been wrong. I
Hmm.
mean, you can see these guys are running for cover. It's almost like they don't want to read Nature anymore
Yeah.
because these articles are coming out in Nature, which is the top place.
Right.
So,
Okay. Wow. So I mean, in some ways, to kind of bring up Craig's book, and I honestly haven't read it. I've heard some summaries here and there. Um, some of what I kind of understand is the argument he almost seems to be making is almost that, like, not that they were Neanderthals, but maybe Adam and Eve weren't human in the way that we think of it today. How does epigenetics kind of see that as an impossibility?
uh, well, going back to that, I was telling you about Neanderthal.
Mm-hmm.
Our difference between us is not the percentage of DNA that we share, but the epigenetics and the junk DNA. So they're completely different. There's really no. Well, here's the problem. Okay, since the 80s, we have been studying to find did we have a progenitor, and we discovered in the mid 80s that there's this mitochondrial Eve, the mother of all of us. And all these studies kept confirming it for the last 40 years. But they said it started about 100 to 200,000 years ago, and we can't get past that. There's no genetic line outside of of the Neanderthal others that shows the mitochondrial Eve. The only way to explain this is either it all started with a couple, Adam and Eve, or maybe there was a population of maybe 10,000 Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens sapien, but Homo sapiens, and that they got bottlenecked down to one pair. And that's what they tend to believe. Well, how did that happen? And why is it that, that's happened to begin with? Well, this other group in Basel, Switzerland, beautiful place, by the way, if you ever get a chance to go, they did mitochondrial studies on 5 million animals and humans. And they discovered that all animals and all humans share one common mating pair. Can you believe that?
What do you mean, one common mating pair? Explain that.
Okay, that we have an Adam and Eve, basically, and that even the animals have their Adam and Eves, all
Oh,
of them.
okay. Not the
Yeah.
same ones, but each species has its
Each
own.
species,
Got it.
correct. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So, I mean, the blowback was just enormous, as you can imagine. I mean, they went back in there and they added to this article, like, we believe in Darwin, even though it had nothing to do with their study, it didn't change anything, but they had to bow their knee to Baal when they came out with that. So they said there must have been some bottleneck event that occurred. But okay, so what bottleneck event do you know that all the animals got down to one mating pair and a group of human beings?
Well, I mean, my
Noah.
name being Noah, it's hard not to remember
That's
that
right.
story.
That's right. So that's what it shows. And therefore, when we try to do genetic studies to where us going back further, say 1,000,000 years, it all breaks down because it goes back to that original mating pair. So for William and Craig then to take paleontology is the answer, and the let me see, the creature that he took was Heidelbergensis, Homo heidelbergensis, which lived maybe 800,000 years ago. Well, we can't study the DNA. Okay, we can only study DNA about 100 to 200,000 years out. After that, it breaks down. So we have no way to know whether that's the case. But on the other hand, we do have a way to know, and they did this, that all these things had this bottleneck event, and it would seem to be that explains Noah's Ark, not Adam and Eve, but Noah's Ark. And so we're kind of stuck at that point, aren't we? So trying to go back earlier makes it more
Right.
difficult.
So essentially, once you get to that bottleneck, as far as what we're able to do at this point, maybe something in the future will change it, but we can't really get any new information and
Yeah,
conclusions
genetically,
outside.
no. Not until we find ways that DNA is preserved.
Hmm.
And they have found some pretty deep DNA, but not that far out.
Okay.
So it's all you're dealing with paleontology, and it changes every day. I mean, there's a group. He thinks it's Heidelbergensis. I looked it up. There's these other people said that really shouldn't be Heidelbergensis. It should be this other name. So they're all arguing amongst each other,
Hmm.
and so I think he really shouldn't have done a pick on that.
Yeah.
Um, I think the problem that I have really mostly is I did I went online to hear him speak at Johnson Ferry on his defenders class, and he was talking about Romans chapter 1, verse 20, where it says, everything is his divine nature and everything is seen so that we're without excuse.
Right.
And he believes that because of that, people who don't get a chance to hear the gospel can be saved because they can call out to God, if you'll help me,
Hmm.
which I believe is correct. I believe that probably the majority of people who've lived on the earth at this point, they estimate it to be around 70 billion, probably the majority didn't hear about Christ, but they still in their minds called out for God and were saved. But then this guy raised his hand in the back, this crusty old dude. He said, Bill, you're talking about evolution now. If we believe in evolution, then we can't see the design of God. There really is no design. So we are with excuse. And it was like a mic drop
Hmm.
when he realized that, oh my gosh, I've destroyed one of my biggest arguments, the anthropic principle.
Hmm.
because he's taking the anthropic principle out of biology, and he was building his whole mission on the anthropic principle dealing with cosmological effects, and he's ruined the cosmological principle with regard to biology and the teleology of it.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest damage that he did. Most of the people I know have talked to who are big, like I'm still his biggest fan. They all say, "Well, he just made a mistake there, and we're not going to, you know, persecute it any."
Right. Yeah.
I don't know.
He's a human. He's
Yeah.
not gonna do it all perfectly either, for sure. Yeah.
By the way, if you go down to the slide with the yo-yos, it's about 4 down from the orange DNA.
Let's see. I think I know which the one that starts methyl epi.
Yeah,
Yep.
this is a picture, by the way. You remember I was telling you that our DNA is wrapped up so that it can go to the sun and back 600 times.
Hmm.
Well, it's wrapped up in these histones that are called, which are like yo-yos. And when it gets wrapped up, you can see the bottom, it's very tightly wound. The DNA is protected from mutations. So the Darwinian mechanism is frustrated by the fact that it winds up. And that's what those guys were talking about, a 90% reduction in mutations, because the mutations that are allowed are biased. They're not random. Random to occur would have to be in an open DNA structure, like at the top. Now, at the top, these epigenes will open up the yo-yos, and then it expresses the things that it needs to make. And let's talk about that 2%. Okay, maybe there's part of that yellow is calling for a window, or a doorknob is the next section, or the others, and then it closes up. So it says, okay, I've got, 3 doorknobs and a window and a door, and now I can make something out of it. You see what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
like it's purposefully making just the pieces that it wants to make,
Right.
and it's a totally different way of looking at things.
Right.
But all these things, by the way, that are sitting on top of the DNA are not under natural selection and mutations. They're in fact a separate code, different than the DNA code, which is it's called the histone code. It has its own set of information, which we're just now figuring out, and
Right.
so it just makes it more complex,
Right.
actually.
So in some ways, this whole epigenetics field, it seems like, from what you're saying there, has two big strikes then against modern theory or evolution, as most of my listeners would probably understand that. And one is that now epigenetics seems to be explaining why we see these changes that happen within species. So
Exactly.
that's one problem. But then on top of that, even learning about epigenetics, what we see is that also would make it harder for evolution to have even happened in the way
Exactly.
that we
Yeah.
thought to begin with.
That's fine. Evolution should not have evolved this way. Evolution should have evolved in a way that the DNA would be more subject to random mutations and natural selection. This is completely different than random mutations and natural selection. It doesn't involve either one. Uh, I want you to go down one picture from that too.
Yeah.
The making of the ant casts.
Yep.
Okay, see on the bottom left, you see the different ant. They're different, like a soldier and a queen
Yep.
and a miner. Those those ants have the same identical DNA. It's
Okay.
like they're identical twins.
Mm-hmm.
But when they study the epigenes, it changes the outward appearance. So
Okay.
That was one of the big problems with Darwinism. This social insects they couldn't explain. Like how could you
Right.
know, it looks like they're evolutionary stages of one another. One should be before the other, but no, they're happening at the same identical time.
Right.
And if you see the little top left diagram, Conrad Waddington, he discovered epigenetics back in the 40s at the same exact time that the modern synthesis came out. He wrote a letter to Nature Journal and he said, you know, even the most, even the best statistician is going to get bored with chasing mutations to the natural selection. And yet we know all these other things are going on that seems to be outside of it. We should be following that. But it all fell on deaf ears. They didn't follow Conrad Waddington. He came up with the word epigenetics. He's now the hero. And that's why we named it after him. Isn't
Right.
that amazing? 60 years ago, the guy
Yeah,
comes up,
that's nuts.
we ignored it for 60 years.
Right. So, like, because as I look at these pictures, I don't know why I've never thought of this before. Obviously, this is all the same species that kind of have these different roles that they take within their colony. And yet, evolution, if I were to believe in evolution, I would look at these and think that these must be different stages of an ant.
Yeah. Yeah, if you buried them in the dirt and made fossils out of them from say 200,000 years ago, you dig them up and say, oh, well, they're different stages
Species.
of evolution. And so now, I mean, this changes everything. When you go
Right.
back to these extinction events and everything, you have no idea whether. I mean, you can say almost certainly that it's not due to neo-Darwinian mechanisms,
Mm-hmm.
but the body has the ability to do these remarkable changes in a short period of time.
Right.
And
So, so is this, I know one thing that I hear sometimes when I'm on campus talking with a student, is this why we have these crazy examples of like, I think it's some types of frogs that can change their gender or some different things
yeah,
like that?
yeah. And when it comes to, you have Mendel, right? Gregory
Mm-hmm.
Mendel, and he discovered how you could crossbreed certain things and they would show up in different colors. We
Mm-hmm.
called that imprinting in dominant recessive alleles. Well, it's all epigenetic. In other words, the epi tags sit on top of it like the yo-yos to express things differently. And that's why men and female, male and female can have much different, stuff going on, even though they share very similar DNA.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they're identical DNA. It's the epigenetics that's sitting on top of it to make them have bigger muscles. Even though the female has the same genes as the male does, her epigenetic expression is totally different.
Okay.
Uh, so yeah, I mean it's and frogs in the same fashion. They can change by imprinting their sexual outcomes, so they can have what's called sexual selection. This was one of Darwin's big doubts as well. The sexuality of plants and things. How can that of animals, how they can switch, but they shouldn't do that way. And this is explaining that.
Okay.
And it's epigenetics.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
I mean, it's just explaining everything.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think this ant thing in a lot of ways is what's blowing my mind because I know so many times when I was learning evolution in high school and whatnot, it was always the paleontology argument. It was look at the structures of these and they seem slightly
yeah,
modified, so that must be a change into a different
yeah,
species through evolution. But here we're looking at an ant that clearly, like, as you're saying, if that was
yeah,
fossilized and evolutionary paleontologists looked at that, they'd tell us that this was a different species,
yeah,
but that's clearly not the case.
yeah. No, that you're exactly correct. And as far as doing phylogeny trees, we've hit what's called megagenomics, where we've got so many people have DNA sequencers in their office now. I mean, they're the size of a big typewriter,
Mm-hmm.
and they can just where all kinds of species are being typed out and they're put into these large databases online, and these people are comparing all these libraries, and it's called megagenomics. And we're just discovering that all the stuff that we'd presumed to be right is wrong. And we can't, it doesn't fit a Darwinian tree at all. In fact, it looks like a cobweb or a rhizoid, they call it, but there is no tree of life. It's just everything is scattered at the beginning. And more importantly, at the very beginning, and they try to get it down to maybe 3 to 5 different branches of life, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. They're completely complex at the beginning. That's against neo-Darwinism. It should be this gradual complexification over time.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but they're extremely complex in the very beginning. Going back to that junk DNA, the junk DNA was in there at the very beginning, and it's getting spliced with the exons. Let me show you a picture. Um, do you see the picture below Francis Collins of the DNA and RNA and junk DNA?
Um, where it says Collins threw in the towel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go to the next picture down.
Okay.
On the left is your traditional view of the central dogma, which I showed earlier. There was
Mm-hmm.
just DNA to RNA and protein. That's all it was. That was all of Darwin.
Right.
Then we discovered on the right that we have all these spacer things called junk DNA, and it's the spaces that are called introns that are actually mixing up the genes to cause different productions. It would be like if you were writing a computer program and you wanted to print something, but then you also wanted to do something else, and then you could throw one routine in there followed by another routine, and those routines may be way off from one another. Well, this
Okay.
splicing can take those two different routines to put them together to make something totally unique.
Hmm.
And those introns are non-coding proteins, by the way. They don't make proteins. If you don't make proteins, you're not a friend of Darwin. You got to make a protein to make a bigger arm or prettier face so that you can, have more sex and have more kids. But
Yeah.
here's all this. But you know what? Those introns are very deep in the heart of studying the very beginning of everything. They were there right at the beginning, and there was more of it than there is now. That is completely contrary to the neo-Darwinian theory. I mean, there was actually more introns at the very beginning. And the thing that is making us human beings complex is we have so much more of those introns. We only have about 30,000 genes at its base, which is not much. I mean, there's tobacco leaves that have 4 times what we have, but our introns are what make us complex, and that's non-coding, non-Darwinian DNA, and it's changing everything how we. But it's possible that after these if you look at Psalms 104, it talks about God takes away the food or whatever, and the animals scream out, and then the Holy Spirit goes back on the face of the earth and repopulates the earth. Sounds like there came an explosion or something. It's very possible that when he goes back out there, he basically utilizes the junk DNA and with the other, whether it's done by a naturalistic mean that you can see the signature, I doubt. It's probably because it's just been designed that way from the very beginning. I mean, it was probably that way when he created everything in Genesis 1, and then it's got the potential to like AI to just kind of rewire itself as time goes on.
Right.
So, but nobody really knows because of that. When you do those trees again, they get into a web, and you can't really tell.
Right. And they're seeing that it's probably a web more because they're looking at the DNA and they're looking at this epigenetics and seeing that that puts to question
Yeah,
kind of the
well, not so much
paleontology that
not
they're
so much
using.
the epigenetic mechanisms, but the non-coding DNA,
Okay.
which is made up of primarily stuff called transposable elements, which are virus-like. We have no idea where they came from. You can't make a tree out of them. They're just there.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, we have 10% of our bodies made up of viruses. Now, this is an interesting point because they're called endogenous retroviruses, and we share a lot of those same endogenous retroviruses with other primates. However, the Darwinists, when they were doing their studies, really didn't look into how this stuff moves or whether it does move. They just wanted to look at it and try to prove neo-Darwinism and common design. However, they also called it junk DNA. Well, it was a pie in the face. They completely got that wrong. So now for them to argue that for common design after they completely screwed up the other thing is very hard for them to do. Also, natural selection does not see into the future. It only sees what happens then. Okay, so evolution only sees what's right in front of it. But we now know that there are viruses that are implanted not in primates from millions of years ago. They're involved with the placenta, the formation of the placenta in a very strong way. And you say, well, wait a minute, how was something put in there so many years ago that's going to be fortuitous millions of years in the future? How does that sit with neo-Darwinism? It doesn't.
Hmm.
And it also speaks to design, you know, that God allowed these things to occur knowing that one day it was going to be valuable. But
Right.
there's kind of where we're at. There's all these
Right.
kinds of studies out there.
So let me even just make sure I'm understanding what you just said there, because this is fascinating to me, but like science is not necessarily my wheelhouse. So I want to make sure I'm getting it. You're saying that essentially with some of that junk DNA, some of the epigenetics and things like that, there's things that essentially were put in place that was almost preparing us for diseases that were going to be way down the road or whatever things down the road.
Yeah,
There's no way evolution could account for
that's
essentially
right.
us being ready for it.
Correct. It has to only work on what is in front of it immediately. It can't
Right.
say 5 million years I'm going to use this, you
Right.
know, and yet that's what's occurring. And the
Hmm.
larger part of the DNA is actually this stuff that moves around, the junk DNA, which we thought was useless, and
Hmm.
now they're realizing is involved with reshuffling the coding DNA, the protein coding, but it's
Hmm.
shuffling it in different ways. Um, so it's like life was multi-potentialed at the very beginning
Hmm.
for these long bank shots that are just incredible to think of.
Hmm.
I mean, how brilliant would somebody have to be to design something that would live for millions of years and suddenly make a baby?
Hmm.
I mean, it's it's mind-boggling, really.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. Well, we got like 5 minutes. Is there any other gold nuggets that we should make sure we hit?
Well, next to the last slide is kind of an interesting book. Peter Ward is a paleontologist, very bright guy. He wrote this book called Lamarck's Revenge. John Baptiste Lamarck was the first guy to actually propose evolution 50 years before Darwin.
Hmm.
But he felt like that God created things multi-potential so that they become other things, which is probably correct. But he also said that the environment is what changes us. Not that we're not through natural selection, which was not his term. Darwin thought this guy was good, and he followed a lot of the things, but everybody basically dissected the Lamarckian views of Darwin away and said that was just a mistake on Darwin's part. And the main reason was, he proposed that what your father does to you while you're alive will cause you to affect, other generations. Strangely enough, 23 times in the Bible it says the sins of the father, the term sins of the father,
Hmm.
and that the sins of the father will be passed to the third and the fourth generation. Well, they have done multiple animal studies to find out that certain things get passed on to the third and the fourth generation through mice and other things like that, like alcohol abuse or stress, PTSD, that they're all these things, drug abuse, depression, schizophrenia, passed to, and so basically, here were the children of Israel were coming out of 400 years of PTSD, and God took them out in a very purified manner because He gave them very pure food with manna and other things like that, pure water. He took them away from bad influences to help these guys change because epigenetically they were probably a mess. And in fact, it took a whole generation to get the next group ready to go into the promised land because the first one came out, they were a total mess. If you remember when they first got out, they were singing this song to God, and then the first bad thing happened. They said, "Let's kill him. Let's kill Moses." I mean, they
Yep.
would flip back and
Didn't
forth. They
take
were
long.
almost psychotic, and that's probably because of epigenetic influences. And he had to get them out in the desert and get them away from that and give them a good diet. But he also gave them 10 commandments, and they're not just do's and don'ts for good things. They're commandments that will keep you away from screwing up your epigenetics. Adultery is an example of one. The stress that adultery can cause can affect your kids, can cause
Hmm.
post-traumatic stress. So all those things were in that. So Lamarck was basically along those lines. And this guy wrote this book. It says, in talking about neo-Darwinism, he says, but on occasion, even a seemingly irrefutable scientific principle and paradigms do falter because of revolutionary new discoveries that cannot be explained by old theories. I mean, bam, this guy's saying it. Neo-Darwin is going down, and they just can't explain the new stuff that's coming along.
Hmm.
So it's a very exciting time, I think.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
by the way, if you'll do that last slide, it's just kind of an invitation.
Sure.
That's my website,
Great.
Darwin versus Lamarck on Facebook.
Okay.
And I've got like 400 people following me, and I post these articles, some of the ones that you just seen
Hmm.
over time, and we discuss them.
Great. Yeah, I was gonna ask how people can kind of find out about things that you're finding and kind of keep in touch with you or get a hold of you. So that's great. Good to have that resource to be able to pass on to people. And I'll probably even put a link in the description of the video
Okay.
afterwards to your group for that. So, well, Vaughn, I really appreciate it. This was a fascinating talk to learn more about this, and I think I understand it way better than I did before. And man, it definitely shows ways that I think will really show us like. It just shows that there's more design than we even thought before. Like DNA
That's it.
already seemed to be showing that so much, but now looking at this epigenetics element of this just shows us like, man, that it's got design to prepare for bad things millions of years in the future. It's
Yeah.
almost like someone knew that might come in handy, you know?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Like he could see the future.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of odd, isn't it? So that's pretty fascinating. So
Right.
thanks a
Okay.
lot. I'll have a link in the description for people that want to get a hold of Vaughn, at least to be able to join his group, if not some contact information. So, any last words? You just want to? I'll let you have the last word.
No, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, I'll probably I have some things you can also see on YouTube,
Hmm.
which I post some of this content, and I've
Great.
got a 40-minute talk on epigenetics. So,
Awesome. Great. All right.
all right,
Thanks, everyone, and we'll catch you again next week.
okay, take.